覺得香港人係其實幾有創意咯，即係因為出路實在太少，我哋一定要揾啲新嘅出路出嚟。之前啲人行嗰條路唔係好 work。
A generation of change is inheriting Asia's world city. Its layers of history, overlapping cultures. Hong Kong is anything but straightforward.
Now, more than ever, Hong Kong needs to understand and rediscover its memories.
One of the things that characterises the Hong Kong mentality today is they don't have any sense of the future.
The Hong government, of course, is not standing with the working class. They don't really care about the people. They are just utilizing Hong Kong.
你不学中国历史，你怎么能够知道这个国家自己祖国？因为年轻人他们都是回归以后出生长大的。
In 1997, the handover was a new beginning.
So one country, two systems means that Hong Kong became part of mainland China once again, but it would have its own system for 50 years.
The year 2047 has become a source of anxiety for many. It was not always so.
We still remember the Beijing Olympics. The people in Hong Kong were very proudly identifying themselves as Chinese. So that's 2008. Right now, it's completely different. For the younger generation, the internet matters a lot.
Has the presence of smartphones in our lives trapped us in digital echo chambers?
So social media, I think it weaponizes politics. Brexit in the UK, the election of Donald Trump, both of which are starting to fracture the international world order. And Hong Kong is a real kaleidoscope for all the things that are happening in the world today.
The coronavirus slipped in so stealthily to disrupt the world as we know it, inducing birth pangs that are shaping this century. Can Hong Kong seize the moment and forge a path that allows it to be a dragon once more?
Quyền都可以保家衛國。幾廿年前啊，香港喺地下，全部啲人喺出邊圍住睇。而家唔係喎。
個熱潮已經過咗啦，喺香港，即係佢已經唔再 popular 啦，已經呢樣嘢。咁所以而家啲後生人就可能對呢樣嘢唔係太熟悉啦，已經。
我叫林全浩，我喺香港教授洪拳嘅。
而家啲年青人最容易接收嘅資訊咧，一定喺手機嘅。就算你喺條街度搭地鐵啊、搭巴士啊，你見到每一個後生仔都係咁樣望住個電話嘅。
For those born at the start of the 21st century, internet is oxygen. Smartphones are lungs. The virtual world their cocoon in these uncertain times.
Hong Kong is a very small place, so people are trying to utilize the virtual world to reconstruct their identity, then to extend the boundaries of Hong Kong to the outside world.
To be honest, like the reason why we take to this race is simple. It's out of love. A lot of people call Hong Kong Hong Kong because this is exactly our home. We have nothing else except this city.
I understand they've been brought up in Western tradition and therefore they feel they like their way of life. I respect that. But does it really see a future with the United States? With Britain? Britain in the state that Britain's in?
Maybe Hong Kong is just locating at the borderline between two value systems that is very different. We were educated in the colonial era, and then we largely followed the global standard. The Chinese version of globalization that is talking about another set of values, stability, prosperity. That's the kind of China model that is also working quite well. Do we embrace that kind of value system, or do we still identify ourselves with the global system?
咁樣長頸鹿都可以食。
真啊！
好勁啊！你可以開大絕喎。
咩叫開大絕啊？
同時撳同嗰兩個掣咯。
你試下撳啊！
俾你撳到有機會。
係啊。
在於我哋呢一代，咁就將佢哋嘅時間擺喺互聯網上面。我哋嘅發展前景其實係窄咗，因為我哋知道個樓價其實係已經高到我哋唔會 afford 到。咁所以其實我哋個 life goal 會 switch 咗去可能其他方面嘅發展。
哇！死啦啩！
好多 freelance 嘅工，係一啲可能係 YouTuber 啦，或者可能一啲係 Instagram 上面嘅網紅。
小青業務轉動，大家一樣地新歌，一片升平，但是它是最大的亮點。小青跳得興起。I realized that I can't afford my living for being a full-time director. 他把他的快樂傳。So that's why I maintain a stable job, but like in leisure time I can write whatever I want.
The younger generation, they're always talking about being as leisure. So they don't have any fixed, stable identity. So like 9 to 2, they are maybe an academic, and then they are a journalist, and then they could be an artist, and at night they could be a bartender.
Although such trendy vocabulary describes their identity today, the roots of their anxiety may lie in the financial collapse of Wall Street in 2008, also the year when smartphones entered our lives. For the young, growing up with uncertainty, the internet became their retreat from the real world.
In the real world, it is very difficult to dismantle the economic structure. But in the virtual world, the boundaries are different. It is possible to create the perfect version of your own world. I think there's a huge expectation mismanagement here. The governments, they always prefer to have further integration between mainland China and Hong Kong. And it's reasonable from the Beijing's perspective. But for the younger generation, they're usually thinking in a very different way. It doesn't mean that they're fighting for things like independence, but at least they wish to retain the uniqueness of Hong Kong, of the Hong Kong identity.
而家成個香港嘅撕裂係史無前例，我相信作為老闆咧，即係都可能都好嬲嘅其實。
Born in a working-class housing estate, this is Roy Kwong. Events were to throw him into the very crucible of leadership.
我既係一個議員，我亦都係一個作家啦。我到而家都仍然係好相信啦，尤其是科技越嚟越先進啦，我哋啲信息好快。舉個例子，以611、612事件，好多人係因為睇完呢個 live， 佢就嚟咗金鐘。
Being well-versed in social media, as well as a popular romance novelist, could he play the role of an honest broker and diffuse an evolving crisis?
6月11號同埋6月12號啦，我諗我係呢一世都唔會忘記嘅日子嚟。6月12號嘅上晝，我喺度，跟住下邊呢個立法會係包圍咗過萬人，因為佢哋知道咧6月12號星期3就會審議呢個惡法啦。佢哋想嚟到阻止11點鐘立法會開大會。你見到啲白色啊，一啲嘅水馬包圍住啦，但係當日全部都係人，全部都係人。當其時我就諗緊啊，會唔會出事咧？我就落咗去啦。
警方嘅警告，你哋正在參與一個非法嘅集結。
咁所以當我落到去，其實我真係唔知要做啲乜嘅最初。不過當我見到個警長嘅時候，我淨係想一件事，我想大家平安啫。因為嗰啲真係我哋嘅市民嚟，嗰啲真係我哋學生嚟噶嘛。而呢啲嘢咧，雖然係個案求助，但係都反映緊喺啲政策度，小問題係反映大政策度。
We have this epidemic of protests around the world, and Hong Kong today is the most important place in the world because it brings so many of these issues into focus. You know, it's got the most expensive housing market. You have millennial versus old generations. There is the tension between the two systems, two ways of doing things. All these things are coming into play in what's quite a complex situation in Hong Kong.
I'm 22, and I was born in the year 1997, the year that the transfer of sovereignty from the United Kingdom to China.
Just imagine if we have internet at that time, none of these parties would be satisfied. So what I'm saying is that due to the internet, things are getting more polarized.
Yet just a few miles across the longest sea bridge in the world, on China's mainland, energies of the internet have been uniquely harnessed to shape an alternative pathway for those with entrepreneurial drive.
After the 1990s, Hong Kong had become primarily a place that's driven by finance and driven by property and real estate development. Hong Kong was doing so well.
The Hong Kong Chinese thought they walked on water. They'd done so well in that previous 20 years. They thought it was their own achievement. Actually, this is not true. They got lucky. Hong Kong got lucky. Because the really prosperous period of Hong Kong was those 20 years after Deng Xiaoping started opening up China.
Heilongjiang, is that Shenzhen?
No.
Heilongjiang, like that.
Shenzhen is nowhere to be found. That was only a village there.
Ping Chao, a young Hong Kong shipping tycoon, was born into a family that knew how to navigate the heady, prosperous times. His professional and personal interests allow us a glimpse into how maritime trade shaped Hong Kong's character.
Hong Kong's a mosaic. Hong Kong's a mosaic. We had this flood of over 1 million, close to 2 million people coming from mainland China. A lot of them from Guangdong province, but also from Fujian, from Shanghai, Hangzhou, Ningbo, etc. And when they came to Hong Kong, they established different cultural hubs. So if you look at the deeper layers, Hong Kong is extremely complex.
我在大陆生活了35年，来这里也差不多30年了。
Such neighborhood blocks hide many local stories. Among them, Madame Lam and her daughter Mooney.
那个时候就是说，我们在大陆有看香港的电视剧啊、电影啊，只是看那个电视剧，看到哎，香港很漂亮，哇，然后来到这里已经是2个世界，完全不同。
The 1997 handover from the UK was still a few years away. China's opening had begun to push Hong Kong's industries to the mainland. The seeds of future discontent were slowly but surely being sown.
Hong Kong also had adopted a very Thatcherite free market-oriented approach. Meant that you also didn't have a large welfare state, for instance, like Singapore. 85% of Singaporeans live in publicly provided housing, but you didn't have that in Hong Kong. And that's when I think you started to see a much greater gap between those who are better off and those who are worse off.
香港的房价是天价了，香港是全世界房子最貴的地方，可以這樣講哦。
好記得有一個調查係有講過，香港人係需要唔飲、唔食、唔消費 ，keep 住做嘢50年先可以買到一層樓嘅。咁但係我哋後生仔聽落去已經會知道呢樣嘢唔係我哋想要嘅生活咯。
Politically, Hong Kong is now in a worse situation than it's been at any period since the handover in 1997. And clearly, they've lost a lot of support, above all amongst the young people. So the status quo is not an option.
俾多隻分數我，而家見到我做緊嘢㗎啦，好唔好？唔好留住你。
我唔係呢一個運動嘅領袖，我只係其中一位希望能夠保護學生、保護年輕人嘅人。我記得我嗰晚係 我印象中我冇休息過啦，冇食嘢。當我知道立法會開唔到會啦，即係嗰日平安啦，我暈低咗啦。咁所以呢一次其實都係一個反思，點解年輕人會突然間近乎係總動員咁上街。
Right now, there's a change of mentality and lifestyle of the younger generation. They are no longer looking for property, no job security, and slashes are very common, so people are having different works at the same time, so you have to make your own choice.
咁所以我哋都好希望咧，呢啲嘅活動咧，真係可以因着呢個社會運動慢慢去平息落嚟嘅時候，大家一齊去回復翻我哋應有嘅香港咯。咁但係因為着呢啲嘅社會運動咧，影響咗好多年青人，可能對於內地嘅發展亦都會有啲嘅誤解啦。
This is Dr. Abraham Lam, and like the slashers of his generation in Hong Kong, he has many identities. A professor, an inventor, and lately, a successful entrepreneur.
咁但係最重要嘅地方咧，就係我哋嘅市場咧嘅規模一定唔及我哋身邊，可能譬如內地啦，可能而家叫嗰個大灣區嘅規劃啦。咁但係我哋最重要嘅就係先要去擴闊我哋嘅眼界，離開我哋自己一個嘅我哋叫 comfort zone 啦，一個嘅安舒區。
With a new office in Shenzhen, he is based there half the week now to groom his business. His startup is expanding by connecting with opportunities offered by China's Greater Bay Area Master Plan.
In 1997, the Hong Kong economy was roughly, let's say, 20% of the size of the Chinese economy. Today, it's less than 3%. So it won't be very long before it's less than 1%, which is very problematic because it's obvious that Hong Kong's future lies with China. But because of the attitude, the mentality of the Hong Kong population, there's a resistance to this process. You know, well, we don't want to be part of China and so on.
I think this is where understanding the Chinese model versus the Western models become very important because China's grown well by injecting market-oriented reforms. And the differences now are around the extent of state control.
甚至係其實以我自己為例啊，即使我算係翻得比較密啲，但係我都覺得佢哋發展得好快啦。咁而我哋對佢了解咧係少嘅。
So how to develop a longer-term mentality in Hong Kong that's part of the growth of southern China? What's needed is a fundamental economic reform program. The Chinese have done it for China, but that has not happened in Hong Kong. A Hong Kong equivalent of what has been achieved in China is crucial.
I think it's a general case like all over, you know, the high streets are dying.
I would say that this town has changed. Why it changed, I can't tell you. I have no idea. It just changed.
People do talk about the changes, yeah. Obviously with quite a lot of Eastern Europeans coming over.
This is Boston, a small town in the UK, caught in the throes of a rift like Hong Kong. In Brexit Britain, the interests of younger cosmopolitan groups clashed with folks in towns and countryside, affected by an inflow of immigrants.
The advent of social media has changed our lives. People are just obsessed with the short term, and I think people need to step back and look at the longer term picture. The first thing that's really important is just to accept that the world is changing.
The reason that I voted to leave is because I've never classified myself as European, because I'm not.
Brexit, Britain's decision to leave the European Union, is obviously tied up with many, many factors. But it does share in common what you see in other countries, which is the status quo. This arrangement doesn't work.
I think the British example is extremely interesting from a global standpoint of how difficult it is, if you go into decline, to adjust to it and to adopt a new mentality.
香港呢係一個即係貧富懸殊好嚴重嘅地方。我哋最新嘅貧窮數字有超過100萬人呢係窮人，係活喺貧窮線以下。你想象到香港700萬人裏邊有100萬係窮人喎。
The rut Hong Kong finds itself in has roots in the colonial system it inherited.
Hello，
俾啲嘢你睇下。
咩嚟㗎？
你個 file 嘅 design。
奇奇怪怪。
As a young district councillor, Roy can only push for some relief for suffering families.
咁住嘅都係草根基層市民，咁啊可能佢哋會面對嘅係一啲生活上嘅困難啦，可能係一啲比較貧窮嘅問題等等啦。咁我哋作為區議員啦，咁我哋就要去想辦法幫助佢哋去渡過一啲難關。
夠足氣，可以抗震，
打攪晒，要打擾你哋啊！唔會啊，好靚啊，少少嘅地方嚇。
咁係，好細啊！
哇，嗰次諗翻起咧就好經典嘅，因為要追嗰條數都唔容易。係啊。
咁香港係需要一個伸張正義嘅人，係你嚟嘅其實。香港住屋問題就比較困難嘅。
So the reason actually why property prices are so high in Hong Kong is because the British created an oligopolistic economy dominated by tycoons and treat the tycoons as a way of governing Hong Kong. So the Chinese, they inherited this situation from the British, and I think the present governance system is, again, is of a colonial character. It has no capacity for political leadership.
It may be a little bit hard for you to comprehend why we are taking this route, why we have to take the use of force. It's just hard for us to not to do something.
咁都好希望我哋嘅特區政府咧，能夠喺不久嘅將來，唔單止一方面快啲咧嚟到去平定翻我哋香港呢個嘅動亂啦，更加重要嘅就係點樣去鼓勵翻我哋一班嘅年青人，俾佢哋更加有目標、有方向，同埋係俾佢哋感受得到咧，我哋嘅社會呢個嘅未來咧係屬於佢哋嘅。
If you were in any other country in the developed world, they would have been suppressed in a very violent way. And I think the reaction in the West has been unforgivable, actually. It's more like, increasingly like a Cold War attitude, where there's black and white. If it's against the regime there, then we're on their side.
That is a philosophical question. Whether you prefer stability or whether you prefer global values. Of course, it's not a perfect choice, so you have to create the third option.
To the southwest of Hong Kong lies the tropical island nation of Singapore. It shares a similar legacy of being a former British colony. Jasmine immigrated here from Hong Kong to find a new life and friends when trouble first began some 5 years ago.
I don't see any opportunity there. I don't see any hope there. I don't see any bright future there. You know, that's why I moved to Singapore, and I still feel that I don't want to go back to Hong Kong.
What are you doing?
No, I wanted to.
Then like that, how are you going to eat? Because everything already is. Thank you. I'm a proud Singaporean who thinks that our government has done a good job. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, the late, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew has done a fantastic job building the country from where it was nothing to where we are now. And I think this was all in place and planned out as to how to situate people, how to house people. That's why we don't get into the situation whereby we are living in shoebox apartments.
The housing market in Singapore is quite controlled by the government, so affordability is not a major issue. And then the second aspect is that the government in Singapore is much more technocratic, much more focused on the underlying issues. I think many people in Hong Kong feel that the government does not meet their own aspirations.
Singapore is different. The government is very effective because of the different mandates, and they can change the policy in one day. And that is doable in Singapore, not in Hong Kong.
Singapore is a disciplined society. A lot of the things and the way Singapore is governed, or things that we do, are very much led by our government. Some people like it, some people don't. Some people feel that it's overly controlling. For myself personally, do I mind? I actually don't mind because I appreciate where we are as a society, as a country. This painting, that's from Hong Kong.
哇，
3歲。 This was when my parents first brought me to Hong Kong. I love Hong Kong because we grew up watching Cantonese Hong Kong dramas.
The great advantage of Hong Kong compared with Singapore is its proximity to China and its relationship with China. You take that away, as some of these demonstrators would do, then what have you got?
去深圳咯喎，深圳以前冇咁多高樓大廈㗎係嘛？但係我認識唔算特別深。
I'm still living with my mother because to buy a house is becoming a very expensive dream. 咁你問下家姐想幾時食飯啊？咁啊 I'm quite lucky that my sister gets married early. So I've got my own room now. Some of my friends are still like sleeping with their parents in the same room.
For Mooney and many of her generation, the love they feel for Hong Kong is bittersweet. They know they may not live their dreams anytime soon, and yet...
Living in Hong Kong is expensive, but it's complicated to describe how you feel about Hong Kong because it brings you a lot of challenges, but it also brings you a lot of energy.
Be formless, shapeless, like water.
Be water. That's coming from the Hong Kong movie star Bruce Lee. He had this kind of philosophy to mix with his martial arts. And that's the very identity of Hong Kong, to be flexible, be water, at the right moments, do the right things.
Bruce Lee's iconic appeal grasped the soul of Hong Kong. It's one thing that binds all generations, despite their recent differences.
We have to remember that culture does not exist in a social vacuum. Even though we call certain aspects of culture traditional, if we compare to 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 100 years ago, we will see a continuum of change. The moment culture stops changing, that's the moment when culture becomes lifeless, mummified. So I think this is a lesson we should learn as we go forward. We should not resist change. But at the same time, like with intangible cultural heritage, we should understand what is important, what cannot change.
有好多師傅咧，中意將自己嘅功夫收埋，唔話俾人聽。但係林世榮咧，佢係希望話俾人聽佢嘅功夫係點樣嘅。當時林世榮佢就用咗拍照嘅技術去記錄低佢自己嘅動作啦。佢可能係希望，就算佢第時死咗之後咧，啲人都仲可以繼續將呢一樣嘢發揚落去。
The generation gap that has ripped apart Hong Kong's families today is being uniquely addressed by a young martial artist, Oscar, as he proudly resurrects his grandfather's legacy by using cutting-edge technology with top experts.
So here we have these wonderful photographs of Lam Sai Wing, from which we could then extract enough information to actually build a 3D model. And then we have the mocap model, which is generated from that live performance. And then finally we have the performance of Lam Sai Wing as a consequence of the motion capture data coming from Oscar.
咁當嗰條片出咗嚟之後咧，我都覺得好感動，因為我感覺好似親眼睇翻林世榮點樣去打鐵線拳。
Kung Fu itself is an import from China into Hong Kong. So many of the masters came from China here. And in a certain way, Hong Kong has been the reservoir or the place where Kung Fu culture has been kept intact. And with the work we're doing now, we actually have the opportunity, I think, to, in a way, re-export this knowledge back into their culture.
Hong Kong has played an unmistakable role in the modernization of Chinese culture as we know it today. Through fusion with Hong Kong's indigenous as well as international elements, it becomes something that's uniquely Hong Kong and yet it's Chinese.
點解嚟文武廟咧？我初初嗰陣時咧就為咗咩廟咯？嗰個細個嗰陣時咧，人哋話嚟呢度拜咧就讀書去叻啲，咁咪我就過嚟。果然咧都 OK 嘅，就一路拜。然後他去幼兒園的時候，他開始學普通話，我很開心。就是說，可以最起碼我們中國人的那個語言啊、傳統啊，都要有一點嘛。我們始終是中國人。
So we have a very traditional Chinese culture, and at the same time, we were a British colony for 100 years. So we always are the place that the East and the West. So as a school, we all understand that we have to teach them Mandarin, English, as well as Cantonese.
停一停，细心听就会听到什么？听到很多不同的声音，很多。
It's by being part of so many worlds even today that these kids, Hong Kong's tomorrow, can continue to push boundaries and make a difference when their moment comes.
中国历史其实对我们来说很重要的，应该从小就要学。所以这种特区制度、一国两制下呢，怎么能够使这个学生树立一个正确的国家观念？ 使他们能够爱自己的祖国。
The local language or dialect, depends on how you view that, is Cantonese, and most of us are speaking Cantonese at home. And that is a very core composition of the local identity, but it's not an exclusive concept. Say when you talk about Hong Kong identity, it doesn't mean that you are not identifying yourself as Chinese or Westerner. Things can coexist.
凍啲啊嘛，好熱啊，係咪一個啊？
係啊係啊。 攞兩個出嚟。如果佢真係做律師，我係建議佢喺清華大學嗰度就係進修一個課程啦，或者係交流。有機會你又中意，咁咪喺清華大學嗰度法律嗰度係交流下。我對清華嘅了解下。
點解你咁中意清華大學？
我從細喺嗰度大灣中意。
I would say the difference between our generation and the generation of my parents is they don't treat Hong Kong as a homeland. That's the main difference. We're born here, we're being raised here, and take Hong Kong as our home, we take Cantonese as our mother tongue. So the sense of belonging, the identity are quite different.
亦都坦白講，因為我其實自細可能到大，我都會成日翻去內地探我哋嘅鄉下嘅親戚啦，咁所以呢個嘅陌生感亦都唔係好大嘅。我屋企人其實都係好支持我去呢個嘅第一就係創業啦，然後後邊咧就去一個嘅大灣區嘅發展嘅。咁特別可能我哋自己父母其實好多上一代咧都係內地人嚟嘅。
We have to remember that 100 years ago, even up to the 1960s, for most of the villages living in the new territories, by far the most important economic and trading center was Shenzhen. So Hong Kong had, from day one, if you like, 3 centers: Shenzhen, Kowloon City, and Hong Kong Island, what we call Central today. So if we forget about this past of Hong Kong, it's easy for us to overlook how Hong Kong is today. Even people living here who consider themselves 4th-generation Hong Kong people, they often overlook that. Hong Kong is not straightforward.
The future of Hong Kong rests in the hands of a generation born around 1997, the year of the handover. But can they move past the current divide?
The masks, the uniforms, using Molotov cocktails, and it's a sort of urban warfare, actually.
Who wants to fight the police? They have guns, we don't. Well, why we are so stupid to take up such an uphill battle? We don't want this battle, to be honest.
Actually, many of us are not very into politics, but what we see is many came out because of the police brutality.
I don't think you can explain it just by saying, well, you know, the police were using violence against them. I mean, there's much worse examples of police violence in the United States, for example. So you've got to ask the question, what's the psychology involved in all this, I think?
It's not only for Hong Kong, it's for everyone in the world. Like the impact of iPhones and the internet, especially the social media. As a result, things are getting more polarized, and we just go to the extreme. And also for the hardliners, because gradually the hardliners, they're also building their own community.
We share the culture, the language. We don't speak Mandarin, we speak Cantonese here. That gives us the sense of belonging to this identity that's called Hong Kongers. And because we're all born and raised here, we have nothing else except this city.
They feel trapped, and they have this island mentality of being under siege by this gigantic China. For me, that is how a lot of the average Hong Kong people, young people, would feel, because they've never really had a chance to experience China firsthand. What they get is the prejudiced information that's spoon-fed to them, manipulated in a very malicious way by a lot of social media, which only enforce and radicalize their view. And it's very counterproductive.
Right now, I think all sides have to calm down and have a comprehensive analysis. There are different movements in Hong Kong, and inevitably people were having a much stronger identification with the Hong Kong identity. But the identities, it's not a static concept, it's changing every single day. So it means that things can change rapidly.
3、2、1，好啦，首先咧就感激各位入到嚟呢個 live 啦。而家咧就元朗區議會小休緊，我後邊咧就有一班新任區議員，陣間我就會逐個捉下嘅，因為趁而家咧我哋仲有5分鐘時間咧，俾大家講一講就係對嗰個嘅區議會嘅抱負啦。好多年輕人咧都會發現佢哋睇唔到將來，佢哋呢一個咧有啲似玻璃嘅天花板啊，即係淨係望到樓上。 但係咧又上唔到去嘅喎。區議會主席黃賢帶領之下，喺區議會嘅討論啦，另邊廂就係立法會有10。
Recently, Roy Kwong entered Hong Kong's Legislative Council for the first time to take on responsibilities as a lawmaker. Can he and others like him engage the disaffected youth and work within the system to effect lasting change?
只要我哋願意係緊記個初心，初心係我哋希望係能夠守住呢個自細長大嘅地方。 改變會唔會短時間內出現？我覺得未必，但係我哋要視呢一個係一個長期嘅改變。
Hong Kong is, in a sense, there's a sort of political paralysis there. This takes us back to the problem of one country, two systems. Now, in my view, this was a really inventive initiative by the Chinese. I'm not saying they haven't made mistakes, but basically, I think the Chinese have been very respectful of one country, two systems. In fact, I would argue in some ways it was too respectful. It was static. But obviously, you have to change things because it has to be treated in a dynamic way. And that is a very complex problem.
And North Korea had also tried to create a Hong Kong, and it's a complete failure. Saudi Arabia, they sent a delegation to Hong Kong last year to study the experience of Hong Kong. So a lot of countries are hoping to create Hong Kong, but it's very difficult.
Hong Kong is now at another crossroads in its history. This time, change must come from a dialogue within, when their youth seek to embrace the power of their dreams.
小青跳得興起時，把一截布抽出，揮到屋梁上，整個人升起，在空中飛舞。
In Hong Kong, like people are so crowded together. It's a small city, so you cannot have your own space. So I think more and more younger people choose to avoiding the reality. You start to like think a lot of things in your own mind. So I start to think maybe I really can be a writer.
我哋聽日會去港珠澳大橋，咁啊跟住去珠海，去睇下嗰啲創業嗰啲園區，因為之後我哋想喺珠海發展，所以咧我哋會去珠海度睇下咯。
咁你珠海嗰度有冇同你對接啊？而家
有諗住去港灣1號嗰度揾人帶我哋行一行咯。
Hong Kong is the global gateway into China, and Hong Kong is Chinese springboard to the world. Hong Kong is the super connector. That is Hong Kong in the ideal world.
Hong Kong needs to be part of the game with the new infrastructure developments, with the bridges that are being constructed and so on. Hong Kong Island is at least no longer an island.
Any transition from one system to another should be gradual. And the Chinese have always preferred a gradual change. They like to introduce things slowly on an experimental basis, see if it works, and then they roll it out.
It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, as we always mention.
而我寫一首歌叫《煲底之約》。會唔會有一日，香港呢一場仗終於打完啦，終於和平啦？我哋可以約喺呢個立法會示威區，即係煲底下邊，可以除低個面罩，我哋終於可以相認。我覺得呢個係我哋好期待有一日香港會見到嘅畫面。我亦都相信呢一日會嚟嘅。
For Hong Kong, as with the rest of the world, the COVID-19 pandemic came out of nowhere and changed the stakes of the game. Now it finds itself straddling the divide made by the tectonic forces of global change.
What's next after globalization is very broadly a multipolar world order. The world will be dominated by three big regions: Europe, China, and the US, and they're becoming increasingly different in the way they do things.
There's a huge shift taking place because a small elite in the West has run the world for 2 centuries, and now new voices are being heard and they're being empowered by this.
China's in the midst of a very rapid transformation from an industrial place to a post-industrial place, and China has a space for things to happen.
日後呢是主要往金融商貿方向發展的，目前也是正處於一個填海造地的階段。
咁所以我哋其實喺咁多個城市裏邊有睇過啦，其實珠海中山咧將會係我哋下一個地方裏邊嚟到係去設立公司，就係因為咧佢有個叫港澳團隊嘅優惠政策，都好方便得到我哋香港人咧年青人嚟到。
In the next and final episode of this special, we get a glimpse into a new world that is taking shape in China's Greater Bay Area.
我是王笑宇，在硅谷工作了有3年，在之后2017年的时候，我回国加入云天力飞。我觉得比较有意思的是，实际上咱们这个大湾区比硅谷的大湾区要大得多，所以我们认为深圳可能是全国最适合海归创业的一个地方。另外一方面也是因为靠海，所以空气比较好，所以大家也比较愿意来这儿。
粤港大湾区，它是一个包括香港、澳门以及广东这一侧9个城市在内的一个区域发展战略，也是在“一国两制”这个框架下如何融合两地的一个战略。
我是从内地过来，我之所以选择香港芭蕾舞团，就是因为它有中国的演员，它有香港的演员，它有世界各地的演员都在这里。对我来说，也是一个很好的机会去学习、去看、去成长。我跟我的同学一起合租了一套公寓，每个月还要再掏几千块钱来住这样的房子，很小很小的房间里面，因为我一直在内地待着，对我来说挺震撼的，差距很大。
If we look at some of the critical issues in Hong Kong, which is, affordability and even lack of access to talent, if we just travel 30 minutes from here across the border, you solve all these problems. So bring 2 and 2 together, the sum could be so much greater.
Will Chen Jiyao please come forward? Can you come down here?
在谢幕的时候，我就听到我的名字，所以当时我很紧张，走到所有人的前面。
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to announce that I'm promoting Chen Jiyao to the rank of principal dancer effective Monday.
If you look at Alexander Hamilton, for example, people know him because of the musical, but he was an extraordinary character who built so many institutions in America, the Coast Guard, part of the army, the central bank, etc. So that if he came back today, he might look at China and say, you know, very, very impressive what you've done in so many different respects.
有一位著名经济学家，他讲，未来几十年，这个世界增长的中心啊，已经不在纽约，而是在大湾区。
Hong Kong is no longer an island. A new globalism is arising in the East, energized by China's strengths. It has the power to wipe out the tears of the dragon.